Welcome. My talk would be, I'm Jonas. I work at Inuits, and during the first half of this year, I did research towards automated instrumentation for JavaScript and PHP, but specifically Angular and Symfony. Who here doesn't know tracing? All right, then I can probably skip the first part and there went my screen. Great, give me something died. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Oh, don't tell me. God, why? Extend to the left. Let's try this again, if the beamer picks up. Yeah, it should be a second. Yes, there it is. Let's start over. So I can probably skip the first steps because you guys all already know it's based on Dapper from the Google paper. Do I need to further explain this or not? Who would like a refresher? Yeah, all right. Tracing was invented for distributed systems to be able to discern where your requests goes through your stack. Because if you have like different services, A, B, C, D, tracing enables you to see where the request has passed and how long, to which service it went and went back, and so forth. This is then translated into spans. So the whole of this those blocks is the trace, but the spans specific are the time the request was at a certain part in your system, and yeah, it propagates through your stack. So common components of a distributed tracing system, so the backend, is you have an instrumented application. It can do requests to a non-instrumented application or to another instrumented application. It will send headers with the requests. So there's correlation between the spans. These spans then get sent to a collector, and that collector will make the different spans, will correlate them and then store them in a storage part. You can then visualize your data with a UI that will query your database, your storage backend. Of course, it doesn't. Instrument application doesn't mean it can't talk to a non-instrumented application. That still works. You just won't have data of that non-instrumented application. We at Inuits were mostly interested in the ableness of pinpointing performance issues and debugging hard-to-find problems that don't often occur. For example, at the end of this stage, we noticed a login button making 1,000 database queries per login, which was very much. Yeah, the reason we didn't want to manually implement our spans, so normally you have your code and you say this is one span, this is a second, this is a child of the former, and so forth. Our projects are quite big and we don't have time to do that manually, so we looked at dependency injection for Symfony and Angular. That means less manual labor, but we did want end-to-end tracing, so the trace starts in the front end, goes to the back end, does some stuff, and goes back. So we wanted correlation between the two. So I did some research, stumbled upon the most frequented tools like Zipkin, which was started open sourced in 2012. uses its own format, which is relevant next, because then you have OpenTracing, and most notable in OpenTracing is Jaeger by Uber. Zipkin in the beginning was part of OpenTracing but bailed out. They didn't agree with some of the choices OpenTracing was making, so they just went on with their own stuff. And then there's also OpenCensus, which is Google's answer to OpenTracing. The difference between with the former two is that OpenCensus doesn't have its own collector or its own backend, so it is an instrumentation library, and it then expects you to choose Zipkin, Jaeger, or any other supported backend to visualize your data. There's also Elastic APM. It's part of the Elastic stack, has an OpenTracing bridge. But Elastic, to get the full Elastic experience, you need to use the Elastic tooling and not the OpenTracing one, because they don't have all the OpenTracing bridge doesn't have all the features the Elastic APM implementations have. So then we looked at the implementational possibilities for dependency injection, and for PHP and Symfony. That was OpenCensus and Zipkin. Jaeger or OpenTracing, for that matter, didn't have any real PHP support, let alone automated instrumentation for Symfony. OpenCensus actually has it all in one. It has PHP as a library, and then it has Symfony and Laravel as frameworks integration. Zipkin is the library itself, but there is a community project which enables you to do automated instrumentation. But the community project is written by the core maintainer of the PHP implementation of Zipkin. So it's a community project in the sense that it's not under the Zipkin namespace, but it is written by the same guy. So there's heavy support. JavaScript is a completely different story. There's many implementations for Node.js, but only a few for browser-based tracing. And Zipkin is the actual one with a working library. All the other ones are, so a working library, that I mean you can make your spans yourself in your code. All the others, like Elastic APM, and I saw recently OpenCensus too. They have JavaScript files, which you just include at the end of your HTML file, and then it'll do some magic to create some data, but you don't really have any say in the matter what data it will create. So for Angular, I looked at Angular tracing from E. Wiehauser. He aims to be vendor neutral, but because of the state of the packages, currently only Zipkin is supported. So yeah, he has a core in his library, but he can't do anything with it except implement Zipkin. And then at the end of my course, it was around May, my whole research actually became obsolete because OpenCensus and OpenTracing went together in OpenTelemetry. They do provide backwards support for 2 years, if I recall correctly. But yeah, they stopped doing heavy lifting on OpenCensus and OpenTracing and are now doing much work towards OpenTelemetry. I didn't have the time to research OpenTelemetry yet. It's also still in an alpha stage. The specification was announced in September, I guess, if I recall correctly. So yeah, it's not, my research is kind of outdated because it's the first half of this year, but there's more to come when OpenTelemetry matures. And of course, I needed to test my stuff, so I made some demos. Those are on GitHub. You can look them up. Try them yourselves. I specifically went for Zipkin as a backend because that was the one that was supported by all, but you can use Jaeger or any other Zipkin supporting backend, or you can change the demos if you like. There's some documentation included. Yeah. Oh, maybe I can. Yeah, there's a difference in resolution. So I have 3 demos. The first one is Angular instrumented with Zipkin with the Angular tracing project. Then we have Symfony, the official Symfony demo instrumented with OpenCensus. And there's a small or an interesting thing about the OpenCensus instrumentation, because it also includes a PHP extension, which enables you to go to get more finer details. More about that in a second. And then, yeah, I also have the same demo, Symfony demo, but instrumented with Zipkin. Let's first start the Zipkin backend. That's running. Let's start with the Angular one. You want to start. Let's give it a moment to compile. So the main reason we wanted to implement tracing was because we noticed on heavy usage, we noticed some tardiness, which eventually was the login button. So we have there's nothing yet here. Now if I click around and make some changes, save, you can actually see the Angular demo. You said find traces, and then you see a beautiful overview of your traces. This is my first click. There was some seconds between there. Then I did another click. The put is the change of the name. You see, you get some data around it, and that's all automated. And that's maybe small too. This is the only thing I did was include the library and add some code. The code itself is added in a different commit. So it's 2 commits: the empty demo and the implementation. There was a yarn add or yarn something something, and then some code. So yeah, you see the empty module, because that's actually an interesting one, because the Zipkin tracing is meant for Node.js, but you can compile it for browser-based tracing. But then you need a certain path that needs to get an empty module, because it doesn't get used, but it needs to have something to be able to compile. The actual code is just this. It's in your app.ts. You give it a name. You give it a base URL what it goes to. You give it a sampler. Sampling is, I forgot to mention, is when your system is generating so much traces that it's actually slowing down your application. And so you can then sample only a small part of those traces, so you can throw away all the others and don't slow down your system. Yeah, it's all on GitHub. You can look it up. The rest is code. Now, if we go looking at this, I'll start with the Zipkin one, because that's the least impressive one. And there it is. So I click around. It's just the basic Symfony demo, but then again, now there will be 2, and you see that generates a bit more data, and now here you see more correlation, because you have your root span. That was pressing the lorem ipsum blog posts. But then you have it uses SQLite in the backend, so you then see the actual query it did, and how long that query took, and so forth and so forth, until I got the page back. That's the end of the span, and then you have the same demo, but with OpenCensus, and I'll have a. So I commented out this part. This part enables the PHP extension. So without the PHP extension, it generates about the same level of code. I hope I give it a different name. Yeah, I did. It generates about the same amount of data. It actually less, which is interesting. It shouldn't. Click around some more, generate some more data. So it generates not that much data, but when you enable the module, oh. There we go. You actually get a lot more data. It even traces the Symfony kernel itself. I hope it shows more. Yeah, there we go. So as you can see, that it's a lot more. It actually it also has doctrine additions and so forth. This OpenCensus library, although it is officially in alpha, actually gives the most interesting data. And then you have the kernel itself. The stuff itself. It enables you. The Symfony kernel tracing isn't that interesting, but it also enables you to. It enables Symfony devs maybe to debug the kernel itself, because when a debug statement takes 1 millisecond instead of 17 microseconds, that's a huge difference. But yeah, the data is a lot. But that's just a PHP extension, and when you look at the code, so again, it's just a composer require with some dependencies. And then you just include the bundle, and you create a file, OpenCensusBundle.php. You include it, and that's the only bit of code you need. Whereas if you wanted to manually implement all of this, you would have to start root, start trace, span. It would require a knowledge of the code base and an understanding of the application. And whereas with this, I don't know how the Symfony demo works, but I just include this and I get useful data. So yeah, that's about it. Guess I'm a bit ahead of schedule. Thank you for listening. Are there questions, actually?
You have made
Test.
Yeah. Yes, works. You have made auto instrumentation with the PHP. Did you have tests with other languages? Yeah.
I didn't test other languages because we only have the Symfony framework. But for example, Zipkin has a broad. Let me have a look. Has a broad because it exists. So I turned off Wi-Fi to not be bothered by friends. Let's take the gamble. Should work. Because Zipkin has existed the longest. They also have a shiny new logo. Yeah. Because they exist the longest, they actually have the most community projects. And there's, I thought there was Laravel. Oh, apparently there isn't. The guy who created, he should have a Laravel, I remember. So SQL, he's the guy who made the oh, the OpenTracing PHP, the Zipkin PHP library, and he has some stuff under his personal namespace. I guess because he doesn't want, I'm not sure why. I specifically didn't look at other frameworks because they didn't interest us. But in my experience, Zipkin, if you want to look at tracing and you have a special framework, Zipkin will probably have a community project for it.
Second question about instrumentation. Could I configure which part of my my application would be traced? So I could say.
No, it's mostly all or nothing because you have the odd. It's complete. It uses dependency injection. I guess you could limit it to certain files. I didn't test that because we wanted all of it. And if you, yeah, it's because it's automated, you don't have that much control over it. But then again, you don't need to put much effort in it. This costs me 50 minutes of work, and that's mostly waiting for a composer to finish. So yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah, I think the battery died of this. Okay. Can you just
Yeah,
repeat it?
I'll repeat the question.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
Just one question concerning the library which you have used from OpenCensus. Do you know whether it is also capable of exposing metrics, so in addition to traces?
So the question for the people at home, I guess, the question was, does the OpenCensus library also expose metrics? If I recall correctly, it actually does, but it heavily depends on the on which, and the Wi-Fi died again, on which implementation you're looking at, because PHP is a very under-implemented language. So Java, Golang, Python are the most supported languages, but the OpenCensus library actually has, I thought, support for metrics out of the box, but I'm not sure. Is it in here somewhere? I guess it doesn't then. No, I think now it comes back, the backend, like Zipkin or Jaeger, has metrics, but the language, the instrumentation language itself, it doesn't. But I could be wrong. Yes?
Can you explain your experience with you got the data, and how do you proceed? So just clicking through it and hoping to find something, or did you look specifically for something? So working with that tool.
So the question was, how was my experience with the tool and how did I go around it, I guess? The first hurdle actually was getting most of the tools to work. Yeah, because it's most of the tools actually have officially an alpha state or pre-alpha. So getting them to work, I also, this is small but oh well. For example, the OpenCensus extension had, because they changed their documentation, had a Peckel installation, but it wasn't working. But I needed to debug that, and then eventually I built it from source, and then it gave me so much more information. And most of my attempts were just clicking around in our application and trying to get data out of it. And when it did, the data was huge, the 1,000 database queries. But most of it was looking through obsolete or old documentation, trying to get it to work. Because the OpenCensus documentation, for example, is on a part of their old website. Let me see if I can find it back. There it is. So that looks slightly different from their official website. It was things like these that took me some time to find, because they're hidden, and PHP is an underappreciated language on the tracing part.
I think your question was more like, yeah, you showed us all that requests and stuff, but how do you really make something out of this big amount of data?
How do you interpret the data? That's what you mean. Yeah, it's just correlation. So this is my actual click on the data. For me, it's if you don't understand the concepts, I would advise you to look up the paper Dapper. It's public, and it explains a lot of the base concepts. And for me, I knew our application kinda, and when I clicked around, I understood what happened. So you need to kinda understand your application. In this case, the only visual thing I did was the click. That's the root span. That's the whole request. It took 203 milliseconds. All the rest is the kernel handling stuff. It's the command underlying, and you just need to kind of merge your the visualization with your knowledge of your application. Like for example, with the Angular demo. Yeah, there's not much there. You just see my GET request. My first of /heroes took 504 milliseconds to load, because that's all browser-based. The PHP is all backend-based. We eventually got correlation between the two, so the Angular frontend sends a unique ID with the request, and then the collector can the backend, the Symfony backend, then gets that string, says this is my parent, and then says to the backend, this is my parent, this is my ID, and then the collector will put them together. That's what happens here too. With the Symfony, with the OpenTracing demo. Oh, that's one span. Every child has a parent, and it just sends that to the collector, and the collector will merge those before dumping them to the database.
So I got it right, you did not use live data, you just did the test in your application, so you manually clicked through that, and then, okay, then it's...
Yeah, it's just clicking around, and then I knew, okay, sure. Most of the time I just left, for example, this page open, and I just did F5. Great, I closed the backend. So I just pressed F5 to have the same span all over again. And if you now look at, you'll see it should, but it does. And then you see here less than a minute ago, I sorted on newest first, and then you automatically knew this is the thing I pressed, and then you had correlation between what you did and what you'll do. Most of the time, you give your spans meaningful names, because you can edit this, because that's just PHP configuration. And then when you go looking without, because this is usually user-generated data, you ingest it, and when you go looking at it, you give it a meaningful name. This is kind of meaningful, you know, this served to this page, and then you know this happened. Other questions? No? Then I thank you. Oh, yeah.
Is it meant to be deployed in production? Or just
Yeah. PHP and browser-based JavaScript, no, because you could do it in production, but the actual implementers say, don't do this, we're not ready for this, we don't advise it. Like if you go looking at where are the language support, there it is. Or there was a feature matrix, sorry. Most, like Java, Go, it's meant to be used in production. PHP, not so much. Most of them are just in alpha or not even developed anymore, especially with OpenTelemetry around the corner. I hope PHP gets a bit more attention for with OpenTelemetry. I know that JavaScript, that they not only will support Node.js, but they specifically will support both browser-based and Node.js. And yeah, I hope it'll improve, because now two forces have joint powers, but we'll see. But the backends themselves, Zipkin, Jaeger, Elastic APM, those are all meant to be used in production.
Okay, then I think we have to keep it with that. Thank you again.
Thank you.